Bird News today, saying good morning. How are you? Did you have some breakfast? I've just been reminiscing lately, you know, thinking back on things. We all like to go back and think about those times. You can remember those times, right? Like you remember those times. Like that time you're mixing some Versed and you're told by the automated medication dispensing machine that you should be reconstituting it with sterile water, but you use a saline flush anyway because it's faster. You remember that time, right? And that vial turned milky white. Thank God you didn't push that into a vein. You remember those times. Those were the days, right? Remember that time you got a septic patient up from the ED who was crumping in the elevator on the way up, and you had to start him on a presser through a peripheral line. You couldn't get another line because he had acute kidney injury as well, and he's swollen like a tick. He needed some dialysis. You remember those times? Remember that time you paged the intensivist and the nurse practitioner 10, 12 times in an hour while putting in your own orders for new pressers, starting 3 of them on your own, and then still running them all through that peripheral line. You remember those times. You know. Remember that time you had to go down to MRI after your post-stroke patient, load them into that tube, and they start coughing, the distortion. Those are the times, right? Remember that time you had to just crank up that propofol? You just couldn't stop it. You had to do it to get the scan. You have to get the scan. You remember those times? Those were the days, right? You remember that time you had a patient come up to you without having any report called whatsoever, and there's not even a bed ready for them. They're just out in the hallway, and you're hooking up more pumps and lines and starting a new line, maybe asking for something central. You remember those times. You remember those times when it's shift change and your patient's hemoglobin comes back less than 5, and to avoid having to call code white, you just tell them that send me 8 units of blood at the same time, and me and the other nurse I'm giving report to will run them through 4 pumps in a half hour. You remember those days, right? Yeah. You remember those times grandma came in after she had a stroke, and the family said, oh, she would never want any of this. And 2 weeks later, you guys are starting a tracheostomy and a feeding tube to send her off to a skilled nursing facility where nobody will visit her. You remember those times, right? Yeah, you remember. You remember those times when you went to work on a psych unit and the best part of your day was when you left work realizing nobody spit on you or hit you? Those were the days, right? You remember those times. You bought those colorful shoes so it'd distract the patients. They were distracted by the bright colored shoes, so they didn't feel compelled to assault you while you tried to give them their medication. You remember those times. You remember those times you're the only nurse for an assisted living dementia facility. You have 2 falls at once, and they're both on blood thinners, necessitating emergency transport for a scan, even though they weren't injured. You remember those times. Yeah, those are the good times. Or that time a patient comes into the wound clinic septic, leg just dripping, looks very sick. But the cardiologist who's picking up shifts there for some reason thinks he can go back to the sniff. You have to argue. You guys get into a big spat about it. Luckily, the second time you check his blood pressure, it's less than 90. So you get to direct admit to the ICU and transport him up there without a monitor. You remember those times, right? Yeah, you know those times. Or you remember those times your patient's breathing more than 50 times a minute. You've maxed out 3 different sedatives. You can't slow them down. You don't know what to do. They're normotensive. They're not tachycardic. So, you strap a bunch of neuroelectrodes to them and shock their skeletal muscles to determine whether you've paralyzed them consistently enough. You just keep them on that paralytic. You remember those times, right? Yeah, you remember those times when it's bad respiratory season and the whole hospital's full. And they end up calling 5 codes in a half hour. You're out of ICU beds. You're out of ICU nurses. You're out of charge nurses. And you're looking around, looking at your buddies, looking at your patients. You realize, well, I'm it. Or else nobody's going to show up to that code. And you hand off your patients to somebody else that's already watching for. You remember those times, right? Remember those times you never took lunch? But the company automatically takes it out of your paycheck. And if you have too many exceptions, you'll get written up. So you sit in front of a monitor, reading waveforms, just eating at your desk. You remember those times, right? Remember those times you have a patient that's so critical, maxed out on 4 pressors. You're pumping albumin like there's no tomorrow. His liver's shot. He's yellow like a banana, bleeding from his eyes, ears, and nose. You have to change the pads underneath every extremity every 2 hours because there's just so much swelling. Yeah, you remember those times. You remember those times the hospital police officer refused to go fingerprint a John Doe patient because it's not policy anymore? Yeah, that time. Remember those times you had to go on Facebook to try to find that poor John Doe's family so they could come in and say goodbye? Yeah, you remember those times. You remember those times you came home after that? You cried because you violated policy and HIPAA and you thought you were going to be fired, but you had no ethical choice because otherwise this man would die alone. You remember those times. Those were the days, weren't they? Those were the good times. So anyway, just remembering some times. Felt like you guys would want to remember them with me. I'm sure you've all experienced the exact same thing. But you can pay money to watch these videos. The innocuous, obscure, very strange, sometimes frightening or confusing videos that I make here every day, except for when I go to a Vegas wedding on Birdnewstoday. You remember those times.